Today I'm going to tell you the story of two Scottish brothers who found themselves aiming rifles at each other during the American Civil War. Alexander and James Campbell immigrated to America seeking better lives, only to be torn apart when one joined the Union and the other the Confederacy, but no one expected what would happen next. Please subscribe to our channel and comment where you're listening from. Brothers divided. Alexander Campbell squinted through the morning fog, the familiar weight of a Springfield rifle pressing against his shoulder. June in South Carolina felt nothing like June in New York. The air hung heavy with humidity, clinging to his blue uniform like a second skin. His company had marched through the night to reach their position outside Charleston, and the men around him were bone-tired, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. "Sergeant Campbell," Lieutenant was cut through. "The 79th is being called to the front. General Benham wants us ready at first light." "Yes, sir." Alexander nodded, his Scottish accent still evident, despite years in America. He turned to his men. "Highlanders, form up!" As color sergeant of the 79th New York Highlanders Regiment, Alexander took pride in his position. The regiment had earned its nickname from the predominantly Scottish heritage of its soldiers, himself included. He'd immigrated to America in the 1850s seeking opportunity, settling in New York while his younger brother James had chosen Charleston. Their choices had led them to opposite sides of a conflict neither could have imagined when they left Scotland. The orders had come down yesterday, surprise at the Confederate fortification at Secessionville, a small village on James Island. It was June 16, 1862, and the Union forces had landed on the southeastern end of James Island earlier that month, with Charleston, the birthplace of secession, tantalizingly close. Alexander checked his pocket watch, 4:30 a.m. Dawn would break soon. The assault would begin any minute now. His hand instinctively moved to the inner pocket of his jacket, where he kept the last letter from James. 3 weeks ago he'd learned from a captured Confederate soldier that his brother was serving with the Charleston Battalion somewhere in the vicinity. "We are not far from each other now," he had written to Sarah. This was a war that there never was the like of before. Brother against brother. The thought that he might face James across the battlefield haunted him. Would he recognize his younger brother after all these years? Would James be among the Confederate defenders at Secessionville? The signal came, 3 short whistle blasts. The men of the 79th New York, along with the 8th Michigan, 7th Connecticut, and 28th Massachusetts Regiment, began moving forward in the pre-dawn dark. Their orders were to advance quickly and overwhelm the Confederate fort before reinforcements could arrive. Alexander gripped the regiment's colors tightly. As color sergeant, his job was to carry the flag forward, leading the men into a position of honor and danger. Enemy fire often concentrated flag bearers, making them prime target. They moved gone with weeds, negotiating hedgerow. What should have been a swift, organized advance, still they pushed forward, closing the distant Confederate fort that loomed ahead, Fort Lamar, named after its commander, Colonel Thomas G. Lamar. The first shots rang out as Confederate pickets spotted their advance and were quickly overrun. But the alarm had been raised. By the time they were 700 yards from the fort, the defenders were scrambling to their position. Suddenly, a tremendous explosion ripped through the Union line as the fort's 8-inch Columbiad cannon fired, spewing grape shot, nails, and chains directly into their center. Men fell screaming around Alexander, but he kept moving forward, the flag held high. "Forward, Highlanders!" he shouted. "For New York and the Union!" The 8th Michigan was on their right, clambering up the face of the fort, followed by the 7th Connecticut. Alexander led his men toward the parapet, his heart pounding. The stars and stripes fluttered above him as Confederate musket fire intensified. At the fort's parapet, Alexander planted the flag defiantly, holding it steady as his comrades fought to secure their position. Confederate defenders fired at point-blank range, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Through the chaos, he caught a glimpse of a Confederate lieutenant rallying his men atop the parapet. The man was unarmed, rolling a log down into the mass of advancing Federal troops before seizing a musket from a fallen soldier. There was something familiar in his movement, in the set of his shoulders. The lieutenant turned, and for a brief frozen moment Alexander found himself staring into a face he knew as well as his own. Older, bearded, but unmistakable. James. His brother's eyes widened in recognition, but there was no time for A fresh wave of Confederate reinforcements pushed forward, and the Union troops began to fall back under the withering fire. "Withdraw! Withdraw!" came the order. Alexander hesitated, his eyes still locked with his brother's across the battlefield. Then a bullet whizzed past his ear, and the moment broke. Reluctantly, Alexander pulled the flag back from the parapet and retreated with his men. The assault had failed. General Benham would order 2 more attacks that morning, but neither would succeed in taking the fort. As he stumbled back across the cotton fields, now littered with the dead and wounded, Alexander couldn't shake the image of James standing on the parapet, fighting for the Confederacy with the same determination that Alexander fought for the Union. 2 brothers, born in Scotland, now divided by a war that was tearing their adopted country apart. And though they had faced each other across the battlefield of Secessionville, neither had fired the shot that would have made them truly brother against brother. That night, as Alexander sat by the campfire, a courier approached with a letter that had somehow made its way through the lines under a flag of truce. With shaking hands, he unfolded the paper and recognized his brother's handwriting immediately. "I was astonished to hear from the prisoners that you was color-bearer of the regiment that assaulted the battery at this point the other day. I was in the breastwork during the whole engagement, doing my best to beat you, but I hope that you and I will never again meet face-to-face bitter enemies. But if such should be the case, you have but to discharge your duty to your cause, for I can assure you, strive to discharge my duty, my country, my cause." Alexander folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. Tomorrow he would try to reply. For now he stared into the flames and wondered how 2 brothers who had crossed an ocean together could end up on opposite sides of a war, each believing in the righteousness of his cause. Wounds of war. The heat bore down on Alexander Campbell like a blacksmith's hammer. He trudged through the Virginia countryside, the colors of the 79th New York Highlanders heavy his hand. 2 months had passed since Secessionville, and the war had carried him north, away from— "Keep those colors high, Sergeant," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison called. "The men need to see them." Alexander adjusted his grip on the flagstaff. As color sergeant, he had already faced death at Secessionville, but had survived to carry the flag another day. The 79th New York had been attached to General Pope's Army of Virginia, challenging Confederate General Lee's troops. "Word is the rebels are massing near Manassas," said Private McGill. "Same place they whipped us last year?" "Aye," Alexander replied, "but we're not the same army they faced then." As dusk fell on August 29, 1862, the regiment made camp near Chantilly. Alexander read James's letter by firelight. "I hope that you and I will never again meet face-to-face bitter enemies on the battle. 2 brothers, 2 causes." He took out a small Bible, the same one he and James had shared as boys in Scotland, and turned to the story of Cain and Abel. By midday on September 1st, the 79th was moving toward the crossroads of the Warrenton and Little River Turnpike. General Isaac Stevens, formerly the 79th's colonel, and now their division commander, was determined to engage Stonewall Jackson's nearby forces. Rain poured down as the regiment deployed for battle. The woods around Ox Hill erupted in musket fire as they advanced. Men fell around Alexander, some never to rise again. The Confederate lines wavered. General Stevens seized the flag from one of the color bearers, shouting, "Give me the colors. If they don't follow now, they never will." Alexander watched as their former colonel charged forward. Moments later, a bullet tore through Stevens's head. Alexander rushed forward, determined that the flag would not touch the ground. But as he reached for it, searing pain shot through his foot. "Campbell's hit!" someone shouted. Alexander gritted his teeth against the pain, but refused to relinquish the colors. Another color-bearer took the flag from him, and Alexander was helped to the rear, limping badly. "The ball went clean through," the surgeon pronounced. "You're lucky. A half-inch to either side, and you'd have lost the—" Alexander spent a feverish night on a stretcher, thinking of Sarah back in New York, and of James, who would never know how— Charleston Harbor, July 1863. James Campbell wiped sweat from his brow as he gazed over the parapets of Battery Wagner. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Morris Island. For weeks, Union forces had been attempting to take Charleston. "I reckon they'll be coming tonight. Full moon, high tide, ideal condition." James's thoughts turned to Alexander. After Secessionville, James had tried to visit his brother under a flag of truce, was denied. Their only contact had been through censored letters. The last he'd heard, Alexander had been wounded in Virginia, but had recovered enough to be promoted to second lieutenant before resigning his commission In May 1863, at 8:15 that morning, Union batteries had opened fire on Battery Wagner. By afternoon, 11 ships, including the ironclad USS New Ironside, had joined the bombardment. For nearly 8 hours, shells had rained down on the fort. As evening approached, the shelling slackened. "They're coming," Bayard said, pointing to troops forming in the gathering darkness. "Those are colored troops in the lead." James confirmed through his field glass the 54th Massachusetts, one of the Union's first black regiments, was forming for the assault. At 7:45 p.m., a dark mass of men emerged from the Federal lines, advancing at the double quick. The defenders held their fire until the attackers were within 150 yards. When the order came, the fort erupted in flame. Despite the withering fire, the 54th Massachusetts reached the fort's walls. Their colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, was among the first to scale the parapet, only to be cut down. The battle devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat. James rushed to investigate reports that part of the fort had been overrun, climbing onto the parapet. "Who goes there?" he shouted into the darkness. 2 Union soldiers lunged at him with bayonets. James pushed them back from the parapet, and they fell onto their own bayonets. More Federal troops grabbed him by the leg and dragged him into the ditch that ringed the fort. James fought desperately, but as the Union forces withdrew from, they took him with them. One of only 5 Confederate prisoners. As he was led away, James looked back at the fort silhouetted against the Confederate flag still flew, but for him, the war was over. He was now a prisoner of the Union, his brother Alexander's Union, brothers in chains. The voyage north was a blur of pain and humiliation for James Campbell. Packed into the hold of a Union transport ship with other prisoners, he shivered in clothes still damp from the waters around Battery Wagner. His captors had stripped him of his lieutenant's insignia and taken his personal effects, including the pocket watch that Alexander had given him years before, when they had first arrived in America. "Name and rank," demanded the Union officer processing prisoners at Hilton Head. "Lieutenant James Campbell, Charleston Battalion," James replied, standing as straight as his exhausted body would allow. The officer looked up sharply. "Campbell? Any relation to Lieutenant Alexander Campbell, formerly of the 79th New York?" James hesitated, then nodded. "He's my brother." The officer's eyebrows rose. "Well, ain't that something? Brother against brother, just like they say in the papers." He made a note in his ledger. "The oath of allegiance to the United States is available to you. Take it, and you can go home." Stiffened. "I respectfully decline." "Suit yourself. Fort Delaware it is, then." The newspapers would later report that the oath had been rejected with the utmost scorn and contempt. But the truth was simpler. James could not betray the cause his comrades were still fighting and dying for, even if it meant enduring captivity. Fort Delaware, situated on Pea Patch Island in the Delaware River, was known among Confederate prisoners as the Andersonville of the North. By the time James arrived in late July 1863, the fort was severely overcrowded, housing nearly 8,000 prisoners in space meant for half that number. James was assigned to Division 22, a barracks where officers were housed somewhat better than enlisted men, though conditions were still grim. Food was scarce: rancid pork, wormy bread, and thin soup that did little to stave off hunger. Disease was rampant. Dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox claimed lives daily. "One day at a time, lads," James encouraged fellow prisoners. "The war cannot last forever." But in quiet moments, lying on his thin pallet at night, he wondered if he would survive to see its end. He had written to Alexander immediately upon his capture, knowing his brother might be able to help, but weeks had passed with no reply. New York City, August 1863. Alexander Campbell limped slightly as he walked through the post office door, his wounded foot still not fully healed. His resignation from the Army in May had been a difficult decision, but his injury had never properly recovered, and the doctors had advised against returning to active duty. "Letter for you, Mr. Campbell," the clerk said, handing over an envelope with unfamiliar handwriting and an official's. Alexander waited until he was outside to open it, leaning against a lamppost as he read, "Fort Delaware, July 30th, 1860. Dear brother, I write to inform you that I have been taken prisoner at Battery Wagner near Charleston. Watches and all other valuables was taken from us, and we are only allowed to have one suit of clothes with a change of underclothing. If you could spare a small amount, it would greatly improve my situation here. Your affectionate brother, James. Alexander's heart sank. James a prisoner. The news hit him like a physical blow. He knew something of prison conditions from comrades who had been captured and later exchanged. The thought of his brother enduring such hardship was unbearable. That evening, he explained the situation. We must help him, despite their modest. Alexander's wound had left him unable to return to his work as a stonemason, and they were living on his small army pension. I'll send what I can, Alexander, and I'll inquire about prisoner exchanges. The next day, he drafted a letter to his former commanding officer, now a general, requesting information about the prisoner exchange system. He also wrote to James, enclosing $5, a significant sum for them, and promising more when possible. In the weeks that followed, Alexander wrote to various officials, seeking to expedite his brother's inclusion in a prisoner exchange. But the system, never efficient, had broken down almost entirely. The Confederate refusal to treat captured black soldiers the same as whites had led to the Union's suspension of formal exchanges in 1863. The war has grown harder, Alexander explained to Sarah, after another disappointing letter arrived. They say the rebels are threatening to execute captured black soldiers or sell them into slavery. Lincoln can't allow that, so he stopped the exchanges until they agreed to treat all prisoners. Sarah squeezed his hand. Your brother is paying the price for others' cruelty. Fort Delaware, October 1863. The autumn chill penetrated the poorly insulated barracks, making sleep difficult for James. 3 months in captivity had taken its toll. He had lost weight, and a persistent cough troubled him. But Alexander's occasional money had been a lifeline, allowing him to purchase extra food and blankets from the sutlers. Mail call, handing James another letter. James opened it eagerly, finding another $2 and several pages covered in Alexander's neat handwriting. Dear James, I continue to petition for your release, though the exchange system remains suspended. Do not lose hope. I've contacted a Mr. Ely, a former congressman who was himself a prisoner in Richmond earlier in the war. He has connections that may prove useful. The letter continued with news of home and assurances of continued efforts. James folded it carefully and tucked it inside his shirt, close to his heart. The brothers who had once faced each other across a battlefield were now united in a different struggle, one against the cruelty of imprisonment and separation. That night, as James lay awake, listening to the coughingless movement of his fellow prisoner, he remembered the words he had written to Alexander after secession. I hope that you and I will never again meet face to face, bitter enemies on the battlefield. Their prayer had been answered, but at what cost? One brother wounded, the other imprisoned, both caught in the grinding machinery of a war that seemed without end. Yet, through it all, their bond had. In letters that crossed enemy lines, they remained brothers first, soldiers second, and perhaps James thought, as he finally drifted towards sleep, that was a small victory in itself. When the cannons fell silent, Fort Delaware, April 1860. The news rippled through the prison camp like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. Richmond had fallen. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war, the terrible, fratricidal war that had consumed the nation for 4 long years, was finally ending. James Campbell stood in the prison yard, his face turned upward to catch the warmth of the spring sun. After nearly 2 years of captivity, he had grown gaunt and weathered, his once robust frame whittled down by poor rations and the damp cold that pervaded Fort Delaware. A persistent cough had settled in his chest during the winter months, leaving him short of breath. It's over, Campbell, said Major Harrison, a fellow prisoner from Georgia. For better or worse, it's over. James nodded silently. The news brought a complex mixture of relief and despair. Relief that the killing would stop, that no more young men would die in fields far from home. Despair at the thought of the defeated South and what awaited them all. What place would there be for Confederate office in this new world? They'll be releasing us soon, Harrison continued. What will you do? It was a question James had pondered through many sleepless nights. Charleston, his adopted home, had finally fallen to Union forces in February. His life there, his work, his connections, all might be gone. But there was one constant, one thread that had sustained him through the darkest days of imprisonment. I'll go to New York, James said. My brother is there. New York City, April 1865. Alexander Campbell stood amid the jubilant crowd on Broadway. watching as flags waved and impromptu bands played in celebration of Lee's surrender. The victory was tempered for him by the knowledge that his brother remained imprisoned. His most recent letter to James had been returned unopened, marked, "Mail service suspended." "They must start releasing prisoners soon," Sarah said, squeezing his arm as they made their way through the crowd toward home. "The war is over. There's no reason to keep them." Alexander nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The assassination of President Lincoln just days after Lee's surrender had thrown the nation into turmoil again. Some were calling for harsh punishment of all who had supported the Confederacy. Would this affect the release of prisoners? They turned onto their street, a modest row of houses where they had moved after Alexander had found work as a clerk in a shipping office. His wounded foot prevented him from returning to his trade as a stonemason, but his education had allowed him to secure steady employment. They were not prosperous, comfortable, more than could be said for many veterans. "There's someone sitting on our stoop," pointing. Alexander squinted, his vision not what it once was. A thin man in ill-fitting civilian clothes sat, hunched on their front steps. As they approached, the man stood, revealing a face much but instantly. "James?" Alexander's. "Hello, brother." James, his Scottish accent thicker than Alexander remembered. For a moment, neither moved. Then, as if released from a spell, they surged forward simultaneously, embracing with the fierce desperation of men who had feared never seeing each other again. "How?" Alexander managed, pulling back to his brother's gaunt face. "They started releasing the officers last week. I was given a worn suit, $5, and transportation as far as Philadelphia. I walked the rest." "You walked from Philadelphia?" Sarah gasped. "In your condition?" James shrugged. "I've endured worse." "Come inside," Alexander said, taking his brother's arm. "You need food, rest. Everything else can wait." That night, after a simple but nourishing meal, the brothers sat by the fire while Sarah discreetly retired early, sensing their need for privacy. The room was quiet, except for the occasional pop of burning wood and James's soft coughing. "I feared you might not welcome me. A rebel. The enemy." Alexander shook his head. "You're my brother, always have, even at Secessionville, when we faced each other across the battlefield." Alexander was silent for a long moment. "Even then, I saw you on the parapet. I recognized you immediately, even with the beard. I saw you, too, carrying the colors. I was proud, even as I fought against you." He paused, then added quietly, "I never told anyone in the regiment that my brother was a Yankee color bearer. And I never told anyone that my brother was a rebel lieutenant." Alexander read a small smile. "Some loyalties run deeper than causes. We each did our duty as we saw it. There's no shame in that." They lapsed into companionable silence. Two brothers from Scotland who had journeyed across an ocean to find a new home, only to see it torn apart by war. They had stood on opposite sides of that divide, but somehow, improbably, they had found their way back to. "What will you do now?" Alexander asked finally. James, Charleston. He trailed off, the word laden with loss. "There's nothing for me there now." "Stay here," Alexander said without hesitation. "At least until you're stronger. I can help you find work once you're well." "I can't impose." "It's not an imposition, Alexander. It's what brothers do." Charleston, South Carolina, 1870. The summer heat was as oppressive as James remembered, but the city itself was transformed. 5 years after the war's end, Charleston was still rebuilding, its proud antebellum facades marred by the scars of bombardment and neglect. Yet there was life returning, shops reopening, houses being repaired, the slow pulse of commerce resuming. "It's changed," Alexander observed, wiping sweat from his brow as they walked along the Battery. "Everything has," James agreed. After 2 years in New York, James had returned south, not to Charleston initially, but to the surrounding countryside where land could be purchased cheaply. With Alexander's help and a small loan, he had acquired a modest plantation, its fields now worked by paid laborers rather than slaves. To everyone's surprise, particularly his own, James had prospered in the post. Alexander had come south for this visit at James's insistence, bringing Sarah and their 2 young children. It was his first time in Charleston since the war, a city he had once approached as an invader, now welcoming him as family. They stopped at White Point Garden, looking out over the harbor where it had all begun at Fort Sumter. The fort still stood, battered but defiant, a reminder of the conflict that had nearly destroyed the nation and their brotherhood. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked suddenly. "Fighting for the Confederacy?" James considered the question carefully. "I regret the suffering," said finally, "the deaths, the waste. But I believed I was defending my home, just as you believed you were preserving the Union." He glanced at his brother. "Do you regret fighting for the North?" Alexander shook his head. "Like you said, we each did what we thought was." They continued their walk in silence. Two brothers who had once worn different uniforms, but now walked side by side as civilians, as Americans. The war had taken much from Alexander's health, James's freedom, years of separation, but it had failed to break the bond forged in childhood and tested in the crucible of conflict. "We should head back," James said eventually. "Sarah will be wondering where we've gone." As they turned away from the harbor, Alexander paused for one last look at Fort Sumter. "It's strange," he said, "how something so terrible could bring about necessary change, and how something that divided a nation could ultimately strengthen the bond between two brothers." James, they walked on, leaving the harbor behind. The cannons that had once roared across these waters were silent now, and in that silence, two brothers had found their way home. Echoes of brotherhood. Charleston, South Carolina, 1884. The cemetery was quiet on this autumn morning, dew still clinging to the grass between the weathered headstones. James Campbell moved slowly now, his 70 years evident in his careful gait and the cane he leaned upon. The morning air held the promise of warmth. Slight chills still lingered, a reminder that winter would eventually come. He followed the familiar path to the small place where Confederate veterans were buried. Many of the men he had known had fought alongside during those desperate days of war. 22 years had passed since the Battle of Secessionville, 19 since Appomattox. The nation had rebuilt, had expanded westward, had begun to heal its wounds, though some still festered beneath the surface. James stopped before a particular headstone recently placed. The inscription was simple: Alexander Campbell, 1833, 1884, born in Scotland, soldier of the Union, brother to all. The telegram had arrived 3 weeks ago. Alexander's heart, weakened by the privations of war and years of modest living, had finally given out. Sarah had written his last thoughts of James, asking that his brother be notified immediately. James had made the journey north one final time to stand beside Sarah and her grown children as Alexander was laid to rest in New York. He had spoken at the funeral, his voice steady, as he recounted not the war years, but their childhood in Scotland, their journey to America. The bond that had survived even as a nation tore itself apart. He carried the flag of his chosen country with honor, but he carried the bond of brotherhood with even greater devotion. Now back in Charleston, James had commissioned this second marker, not a grave, but a memorial, a place in the South where his brother's name would be remembered, even though his body rested in northern soil. A small act of reconciliation, one of many such gestures occurring across the healing nation. From his coat pocket, James withdrew 2 items: a small worn Bible, the one they had shared as boys, and a faded letter, creased from years of folding and unfolding. It was the letter he had sent to Alexander Secession. The words, "I hope that you and I will never again meet bitter enemies," now almost illegible from handling. Sarah had found it among Alexander's personal, tucked inside his own Bible. He had carried it through the remainder of his service, through his wounding at Chantilly, through years of peace. Just as James had kept every letter Alexander had sent during his imprisonment, treasuring each word from his distant brother. "We chose different paths, different causes," James said softly to the stone, "but we found our way back to being brothers." He placed his hand on the cool marble for a moment, then straightened as best he could. The war had taken much from both men, years of separation, physical hardship, the weight of difficult choices, but it had failed in one crucial: it had not destroyed their brotherhood. As James turned to leave, he noticed a young man and woman standing nearby, watching respectfully. The woman held a small child, perhaps 3 years old, who squirmed in her arms. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, stepping quite limp. A war injury, James guessed, though from a conflict. "Are you Lieutenant Campbell of the Charleston Battalion?" James nodded, somewhat surprised to be recognized. "My father served with you at Secession," the man he often spoke of you and of your brother on the other side. He gestured toward the memorials. He said that you two represented something important, that family bonds could survive even the worst division. James felt a tightness throat. Your father was right. The war took much from all of us, but some things it could not take. The young man nodded, then introduced his wife and son. A boy named Alexander, James noted with a bittersweet pang. "Would you tell us about it sometime?" the young man asked. "About you and your brother? I think it's a story that should be remembered." James looked back at the memorial stone, at his brother's name carved in marble. Perhaps that was Alexander's final gift to him, not just the memory of their brotherhood, but the opportunity to share its lesson. "Yes, I would be honored to tell you about two brothers who found themselves on opposite sides of history, but who never forgot they were family." As they walked together toward the cemetery gates, James felt a curious lightness. The story of the Campbell brothers, one in blue, one in gray, would live on, not as a tale of division, but as a testament to what endures when the cannons finally fall silent.